A couple of questions which I want to come back to. Given, we've got this very big US Africa summit, if I can just touch on, I'm sure you're bored to bits being asked this question, but people tend to see it in a binary way, US versus China in Africa. How do you contextualize this? Is it a collision? Is it a win-win? Is Africa winning because we got more trading partners than before? Who holds the balance of power in this relationship? How do you see it?
I think that Africa is entering into a moment of maximum possibility for itself. Not only has it been growing very fast for the last several years in general, but as everyone knows, there are two other kind of boons that have taken place. There's a technological boon that has created a communications revolution for Africa that has made it...
Do you notice that yourself?
Oh, absolutely. That has made it possible. My wife is from West Africa, and we were talking last night about how in the old days when we lived in West Africa many years ago, how difficult it was to make an appointment with someone. If you either you catch them while they're at their desk, or you don't catch them, because they don't. That's the only way, and so you have to keep going back to their office, and it's hit or miss. And how much time you would waste in that process? That's gone now, right? And this is just a very small piece of what it means to have had a communications revolution. So there's these technologies which are just completely erasing all sorts of barricades and hurdles that had stymied Africa's the sort of momentum of life in Africa. And that's really important.
That's a great way to characterize it.
At the same time, you have what a lot of people have commented on, which is this demographic boom that has risks to it, but which also offers...
Everyone keeps saying it's a dividend, but it does have risks.
It has risks for sure.
I mean, historically, if you've got lots of young men without a job,
you've got trouble. Yeah, and so you asked me about win-win, which is actually a Chinese propaganda term, which I have problems.
Well, you were one of the few people who described it as such, and I'm tired of hearing it because it's really like a trope now.
Yes, and it's patronizing.
It's very patronizing.
What we're doing is of equal benefit to both parties. Well, nothing could be further from being takeable for granted, if you will. Right, but there is a win-win prospect for Africa in having so many international players be interested in Africa at the same time. In the Cold War, you essentially had two blocks that were competing for Africa. Now you have a kind of a multipolar world. It's not just China. China is the biggest of the new players. But you have India, you have Brazil, you have Turkey. Turkey is a big player in Africa today. You have Malaysia and Vietnam. You have all of these people who are peoples who are coming sort of awakened about Africa and what Africa means to the world. And this is an opportunity for Africa. It's only meaningful, however, to the extent that African countries, unfortunately, the continent is as balkanized as it is, but it's only getting more so. Only more meaningful to the extent that African countries understand that this is a perishable moment. The demographic dividend is perishable, and the fascination, this sort of nascent fascination with Africa that we're seeing all over the world is perishable.
Do you feel that our policymakers, African policymakers, appreciate that, or do you think they think it's a lottery and this is the new normal?
I'm afraid that my sense is that too many people think that this is something they can take for granted, and it's it's something that's owed to them. That we've been neglected for all this time. They're finally awakening to us. You have to earn the sustained attention. It's one thing to get the initial attention, but to keep the attention, you have to earn that. And that only happens via serious work. Making, first of all, serious calculations of what true national interests are. That means
that's my biggest issue. I don't think many African governments understand what the national interest is.
Most African governments are very poor at that. What they have is the interest, typically, of a very narrow elite that is essentially rent-seeking. And the foreign partners...
Have you seen change in that?
The foreign partners can read this. They know what a rent-seeking elite is, and they know how to play the game with a rent-seeking elite. And so this is very dangerous for Africa. I see here and there countries that are beginning to broaden their sense of what national interest is and to think more seriously about this, but not enough of it.
Who's the leader in thinking that way, in your opinion?
Well, I think you can make a fairly important correlation between countries that have a kind of a genuine sense of democracy kind of coursing through their lifeblood, and a ripening sense, not a mature yet, but a ripening sense of national interest.
Yes.
So in a place like Ghana, with all of its problems,
Yes,
and Ghana
yes.
has had a lot of problems very recently with the currency, and this is a classic Ghanaian problem of, coupling the election cycle with irresponsible spending, so that the incumbent party can try to win the election. However, you've had a pretty interesting conversation with Ghana about managing new resource wealth. And I think this bodes well for the future. I think, the tapping of new resource wealth in East Africa, which is going to be massive,
think it will be.
is at an earlier.
You think it's going to be massive?
I do,
Yes.
but it's in an earlier stage in its life cycle than it is in Ghana yet, and so it's hard to know just how serious the national interest discussions are going to be in these places. I wouldn't say that the initial signs are terribly encouraging.
Here,
Here,
East Africa.
no. That
East Africa, you're talking from Mozambique up.
I'm talking Mozambique, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda. I'm afraid that the idea of a windfall of essentially hydrocarbons.
Yes.
What this means and how to manage this properly and how to get the maximum benefit for a broad national interest
Yes.
has not been discussed and debated and, most importantly, integrated into the kind of political class discussion as it needs to be. Here's the thing, so you have typically in these kinds of resource play situations a 20 or 30 year window where the known reserves are going to be drawn down. And yes, in some cases, new minerals or in some cases, that same resource will be more and more will be discovered. So 20 or 30 years doesn't express the full life of it. But let's say you have a 20 or 30 year run in oil or gas or what have you, right? That's an opportunity to turn this underground wealth into above ground wealth. What does above ground wealth mean? Above ground wealth means you have created a different kind of human landscape. You've created a population base that knows how to create wealth through its own ingenuity, invention, labor, effort, entrepreneurship, right? That comes via education. That comes via creating a kind of predictable set of rules that are enforceable, that are unbiased, that are not regional or sectarian or partisan or tribal, etc. And frankly, there's not enough of that kind of ethos yet in the East African discussion, so far as I can tell.
That's a very interesting point. I want to return to the point of the US and China just briefly, one more time. I think it was in your article, I think in Business Week, where you were talking about how the Chinese see Africa as an El Dorado. Am I correct? Yes. And you were saying in the same article that the US tends to look at Africa, ungoverned spaces, Al-Qaeda recalcitrants through a counter-terrorism prism. Now, when I look at, obviously that's clear, and to me, do you think the US still has a decisive military advantage on the continent through US-Africa Com and through control of the sea lanes, or do you see the US having a hard power influence over the continent?
The U.S. has a hard power influence over the continent. The continent has a certain reliance on the United States to help provide a kind of underlying security and protection against all kinds of non-state actors, et cetera, et cetera. But vis-a-vis China, this American reflex to see everything in security terms is arguably to the disadvantage of the United States.
Yes.
In other words, the United States is so preoccupied with seeing Africa in these terms that it can't see Africa as clearly or as readily as it needs to see Africa in other terms. Here we have Obama meeting this week with 40 or so African leaders, right? Supposedly, the economy is supposed to be a highlight of this.
He's got 200 chief executives apparently on the sidelines.
Yes, and so there will be a lot of deals struck, no doubt. But my early sense is that the United States cannot really get away from a security conversation. And the way China, the way that China has made up so much ground in Africa so quickly is by being focused. The Chinese have said, we'll free ride on the American security obsession.
Yes.
We'll let the Americans take care of that.
Was someone saying if you take South Sudan as an example, they're free riding on that there?
Well, South Sudan is a bit of a special case. They are more or less free riding, but the Chinese are more proactive in South Sudan than they are in most places in Africa. In other words, they've invested enough in South Sudan that they feel that they need to be players politically and even to have a look in terms of the security arrangements of South Sudan. In most of Africa, the Chinese said, look, we have to evacuate how many tens of thousands of Chinese people from Libya?
That's right.
Let the Westerners help us. We've had to evacuate people from Chad. Let the Westerners help us. We have to be on the lookout in Nigeria. We'll rely on the Westerners to give us the intelligence or the security help in a pinch, right?
Yes.
In South Sudan, they're being a bit more proactive.
So do you think that model is going to change as their investments become big like they are in South Sudan?
I think that China is, I think that the rules of power in the world are not particular to any nation, and that as China becomes a great power, meaning as China develops entrenched and very important economic and human resources around the world, China will begin to see its power in terms of those resources. The need to be able to project power, to protect their interests, and to protect their people. I think it's inevitable, and we're seeing the beginnings of the Libya thing was a wake-up for China. We have, we've got all of this business in Libya, and suddenly we have to evacuate lots of people. We need to have a capacity for that in the future. In fact, we need to have a capacity to be able to intervene somehow, whether overtly, directly, or not, in the future in sensitive places in Africa, so that we don't have to withdraw our people. In other words, preemptively or proactively become engaged in this taboo thing called the internal affairs of other countries.
Let's go from there, because that's been a great selling point. As African leaders receive these Chinese visitors, say we don't want anything to do with your internal affairs, that's your business. In the background you've got the US ambassador saying, what about democracy, what about human rights? And it seems it has played in the Chinese favor, has it not? Because has it?
It does with regimes.
Yes.
So because the regimes are not necessarily thinking, as we said a moment earlier, about broadly defined national interests, but they're thinking about narrowly defined rent-seeking opportunities. They think non-interference is a great thing. That doesn't mean that their people agree with them.
Yes.
That doesn't even mean that the broader elites agree with them. It's a convenient thing if you're sitting on top of a pile of cash and chopping, as they say in Nigeria, wantonly, to have someone say, look, we're not going to interfere in your business. You do it however you want. We just want you to sign the contracts and pay us as we agreed, right? But the risk here for China is that, as a number of these situations go bad, peoples in one African country or another begin to see China as part of their problem. And I don't think the Chinese are sufficiently attentive to this prospect yet, or perhaps the problem is slightly different, that their political system, there may be people who are attentive to this, but their political system is unwieldy and unable to respond quickly and nimbly to the changing circumstances on the ground. They're dug in terms of the ideology of non-interference. It appeals to them for a particular domestic reason. China is, in a sort of old world sense, itself an empire. You have the central part of the country, which is Han Chinese people, 90-some% of the population, and then you have the entire rimland of China, composed of 54 ethnic minorities, who have one degree or another of ambivalence about being called Chinese or being subjected to Chinese rule, having to live under this system, subsumed into the greater China. And so China knows that this is a very fragile concoction that came into being very late in terms of the modern history of the world. Only in the late 19th century did this sort of thing begin to gel with Xinjiang, the great northwestern Muslim province, and Tibet, and various other pieces sort of coming to be consolidated into what we see as China on the map today. And so China knows that at any moment things can go really bad in China, and they don't want other people interfering in their situation. They don't want some foreign country or the UN or any other actor saying, you can't do this, you can't do that, or we're going to intervene.
So you think the whole internal affairs policy was driven by a Chinese
Very much. Yes, that people should not interfere with us. Correct.
How interesting.